Each of them is going to speak from the podium for a few minutes this morning. They're settled in. Geraldine Gardner, first person here to my left, your right, from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Next is Allan Mallach from the Center for Community Progress. Erik Bichard from the University of Salford, Manchester, England. Vivian Loftness, my colleague from Carnegie Mellon University. Toni Griffin from the City College of New York. And Joel Mills, my co-chair, American Institute of Architects. So Geraldine, you will lead off.
Thank you, Don. Good afternoon. I'm Geraldine Gardner, Director of Urban and Regional Policy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which is a transatlantic nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. Before I get started, I would just like to thank and recognize our colleagues from Europe who have traveled all this way to join us in this important transatlantic discussion. So I'm delighted to be here today to share a few thoughts about the first workshop theme, Repositioning the Post-Industrial City in the Global Economy. So we're clearly not starting the Remaking Cities conference off with a warm-up topic. We are diving right into one of the most complex and biggest issues facing post-industrial cities. One that is fraught with challenges, but also ripe for opportunities. We may not all be experts on this issue in the room, but we all know that the global economy is having a profound impact on cities. We've read about it, some of us in the room have written about it, and certainly all the city leaders and practitioners with us today are navigating this transition in their cities. Some of you may be thinking, why isn't the whole Congress focused on this topic? Others of you might be thinking, why does this theme stand on its own when people, economy, and place are so intertwined? Certainly our case study cities of Bilbao, Spain, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin reflect this. Repositioning and growing their local economies can't be separated from physical revitalization, human capital investments, urban governance, and leadership, among other issues. These experiences are confirmed in recent research that has shown cities that are investing in placemaking, walkability, expanding housing choices, and mobility, those investments are paying off when it comes to economic development. Yet while these are vital characteristics for a thriving post-industrial city, a vibrant and resilient economy is still paramount. Resiliency, as we all know, is a fundamental challenge facing US and European post-industrial cities, especially in this current crisis. Despite what Americans might view as a strong social safety net in Europe, the continent is facing an extreme crisis because of the economic crisis that they are now facing. These effects are not felt evenly across the continent. While the headlines in American press share stories of Greece and Portugal, Europe's strongest economy, Germany, is also facing this. Just as in the US, European cities and regions are having to cover basic services with shrinking budgets, growing debt, and higher demand. An austerity strategy for cities is not the way out of crisis unless it is coupled with growth. But what kind of growth? How can post-industrial cities and regions link and leverage their assets to reposition themselves within the global economy, not just to survive, but to compete? Who needs to be at the table to set this agenda and to implement it? And how can we ensure that this new economy is accessible, that there's a pipeline of local talent that's ready to step up and take the jobs and start new businesses? And perhaps most importantly, what are the ways to ensure that the benefits of this new economy are not just concentrated at the top? These are just some of the questions that await us in Workshop 1. Our two thought leaders for the workshop, Paul Gottlieb and Jennifer Vey, will stoke this discussion with their impressions of growth and strategies around innovation districts. Well, we invite the delegates in Workshop 1 to share your experiences and thoughts on these issues. And most importantly, we ask you to work together to co-create a series of recommendations to help guide this issue as cities and regions tackle it now and in the future. This Congress presents a unique opportunity for peer-to-peer dialogue that is outcome-oriented. my favorite kind. In conclusion, I believe that there is an opportunity here for the post-industrial cities to lead the way in thinking about how to manage this economic transition that is sustainable and equitable. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing the results of the deliberations on Friday.
Thank you, Don. And as a veteran of the 1988 conference, I'm delighted to be back here. And in the second workshop is entitled, if I remember correctly, The Physical Form of the Post-Industrial City. And there's a paradox to the physical form of the post-industrial city, which is that in some respects it's widely seen as obsolete, yet in other respects increasingly appealing and increasingly seen perhaps as a model for a more sustainable future. And this is rooted in that these cities came into being for reasons totally different from what exists today. They were built, cities like Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit, they were built to accommodate America's industry, and secondly, to accommodate the people who worked in the industry and their families, largely married couples raising children in all the neighborhoods that surrounded the factories. And finally, a downtown dominated by local corporations, local stores, and local businesses. All of that is an artifact of history now. The economic conditions have changed, the industry is largely gone, and the demographics of the United States have changed dramatically. And the city's economies are increasingly centralized, dominated by major medical and educational institutions, of which Pittsburgh, again, is a great example. So in the course of this, I think downtowns have emerged across cities as vibrant, dynamic places, not traditional downtowns. In fact, predominantly residential and mixed-use areas, very different from the traditional function of downtowns. But this has become a very partial and uneven change for the cities. And in fact, people who say the cities are coming back, the cities are reviving, are actually typically talking about a very small part of those cities, while large parts of the cities, especially the single-family neighborhoods that take up most of these cities' land area, are in many cases barely holding their own. So this is the challenge for this workshop and for thinking about the physical form. Here is a city built for a radically different purpose that now has to confront different demographics, different population, different economy, different transportation systems. And the question is, how do we do that? And how should, ultimately, the physical form of cities, on the one hand, change to accommodate realities, but on the other, preserve what is strong and good about that physical form in order to reflect the new economic directions, the changing demographics, and the new housing demands that exist here in the 21st century. And again, for me, it's easy to pose the questions, and I certainly hope at the end of 2 days, the workshop will come up with some answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. So I'm Erik Bichard. I'm a professor of regeneration and sustainable development at the University of Salford. So let's get this out of the way straight away. Hands up. How many of you can confidently point out where Salford is on a map? That's not bad. That's just over a dozen of you. Yeah. All right. Well, most of you do know where Manchester is, I hope, which is in the northwest of England. And it's my pleasure to be a part of the workshop where we're going to be talking about innovation. Just outside my window is the first street in the world to ever be lit by gaslight. And Manchester as a whole can claim a whole string of innovations and inventions, including the computer and most recently graphene and lots of things in between. So it's a pleasure to be talking about it here in the context of post-industrial cities. Now, innovation is one of those subjects, isn't it, that conforms neatly to that classic metaphor of the elephant and the partially sighted people. Everybody who approaches it thinks it is and looks and feels like something different from the next person who comes across the animal, depending on which bit you're approaching and which direction. Now, we are, of course, going to be dealing with a technology, knowledge capital, and all those things that contribute to successful, sustainable city futures. We'll certainly be looking at roles of universities, higher and further education institutions, skills training, leading and niche manufacturing, research and development, and indeed public-private partnerships, the role of the third sector, and in various enabling routes. It's what you would expect from what has been summed up broadly as the Smart City Agenda. And we will be asking that question, whether that whole agenda has been played out or whether actually it's an essential part of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this Congress. But for those of you who have a number 3 on your badge and are challenged to open a can or wire a plug, never fear. Because we are not drawing the lines of innovation so narrow as to only talk about technology. We're going to be exploring innovation and culture, food, sport. We're going to look at innovation as it applies to retail. We're going to ask questions like, is there an alternative to place-based consumption? Should that define places, even though that has been extremely successful in the past? Is there a place in the conversation for the rebirth of Main Street, High Street? And what part does that play in major cities and in particular local commercial areas? We're certainly going to be looking at governance. What's the most effective form? And here we expect to overlap to Workshop 5, but that's not a bad thing. In fact, I think you can expect all of us to be overlapping with everyone else. That is really how it should be. But governance is crucial. I just finished some research on community groups who are mobilizing for pro-environmental activities. And I have to say, somewhat disturbingly, there was an almost universal view that authority in any form is not going to get us out of the problems that we're in now. And that's sobering for politicians and for bureaucrats across the piece, because if people have lost faith in the ability of top-down, then what should we be doing? How can we innovate to allow bottom-up in a much more effective way, a less tokenistic way than has happened in many places thus far? We're also going to look at innovation in terms of climate change and adaptation. Things like community energy, the influence of low-carbon policy on the vulnerable. And we're going to look at innovation in terms of new funding mechanisms. Famously, the outgoing Secretary of State for the Treasury, when our new coalition government came in, left a little note for his successor, said, "Good luck, there is no more money." And I think we have to face that reality, although that might wobble around a little bit. How do we innovate to actually bring places to the kind of condition that supports everyone's aspirations? Do we need to redefine that? Do we need to redefine the unit that we're thinking about from cash to carbon? Do we need to think about levering public sector money through innovative ideas, like making sure that the successes we have on environmental and social fronts can be monetized and then paid to us in the form of things like social impact bonds to get investments started where there is absolutely no other money to be had? And I'm actually very pleased to be doing some of that research right here in Pittsburgh, where there's some great stories to be told. I'll just finish really by talking briefly, telling you a story about innovation and the purpose of place. It's a little town on the Lancashire, Yorkshire border called Todmorden. And they started an initiative called Incredible Edible. One day, a bunch of them went out at night and they planted a bunch of fruit and vegetable in the policemen's flower plots. It seems a quaint and odd little British story, but actually what they were doing was starting a movement that's now almost 200 strong across many parts of Europe, particularly in France, but many parts of England. What they figured out was that food was the lingua franca of regeneration and renewal. That people don't respond to a whole bunch of agenda, particularly when it comes from authority. But they do need to eat. And everybody shares that. That's their motto. If you eat, you're in. How inclusive is that? And when I interviewed them, I said, you know, it's an innovative idea. What word would you attach to the innovation that you've applied to the renewal of your place? And I was expecting to say, oh, sustainable living, healthy eating. The innovative word they said that applied to what they were doing was kindness. That is startling. And yet, when you think about that, that's probably one of the most innovative things I have heard for a long, long time. Because if we cannot cooperate, if there is not trust in all of the aspects we're going to be talking about for the rest of this Congress, we really don't have much of a future. So I'm looking forward to working with you on this and many other aspects. Thank you.
So it's a pleasure to be here. I had the shortest distance to travel, almost, for being on this panel, Vivian Loftness at Carnegie Mellon in the School of Architecture. And truthfully, the caliber of this group is truly impressive, and I can't begin to add something to the knowledge that's in this room. But I think maybe we can corral that knowledge. And the fourth workshop actually is going to grab a chunk of the first workshop and talk about economics, and a chunk of the second workshop and talk about physical form, and a chunk of the third workshop and talk about innovation, all relative to the infrastructures that we have underneath and threaded through our cities. If I told you we had hundreds of millions of dollars sitting on the table that are underutilized for rebuilding our cities, you would basically say, oh, no way, I've looked at every penny and we've squeezed everything out of every rock. But truthfully, we have infrastructures that demand continuous investments, and every citizen and every household is pouring into those investments, and of course, local, state, and federal governments are pouring into those investments. So let's just talk a minute about some of those infrastructures. We have potable water infrastructures, many of them declining in the post-industrial city, many of them leaking extensive amounts of water. We have stormwater returns combined with sewer returns, so we've got the combined storm sewer, and in many cities, $2 to $4 billion of storm sewer retrofits that are mandated by federal standards. Cash on the table that if we don't know how to deploy to rebuilding our cities, we have missed a huge opportunity. We've got solid waste infrastructures for hauling things away house by house in a pretty inefficient and noisy and wasteful fashion. And then on top of that, we have the networks that we're constantly rewiring and recabling to every household. We've got the electric networks and the huge repository of grid enhancements that are coming down the pipe as we start to look at distributed energy, as we start to look at reliable energy. And we also have the cable industry. And if you start to look at what we spend per household, on average, most households are spending at least $1,000 for having cable networks and fiber to their homes, on top of their electric bills and their gas bills and their sewer waste bills. So we have a huge infrastructure network, and let's add a few more to those infrastructures. One is heat, which for most of us is gas, but is sorely in need of rethinking, especially as the nation starts to try to address carbon capture and ways in which we can, through cogeneration, combined heat and power, actually make our homes the carbon capture and storage, rather than burying things deep in the earth at tremendous expense. We are missing the opportunity as designers in the urban context of grabbing those resources and being the answer. And then let's add transportation and food as the last two infrastructures. And maybe transportation is the wrong word. Maybe we need to talk about mobility. We have to change the dialogue so that we're not looking at how to move cars and how to invest resources in repaving streets, but how to move people through a multimodal transportation network. And finally, food. And obviously, everyone in this room is actively involved in each of these, but somehow we have not made the message clear that those who are trying to revitalize neighborhoods and cities have not yet grabbed the resources and turned that equation around. I'm going to name a few notable exceptions. Philadelphia has put out a storm sewer management plan that would actually transform neighborhoods. They're using surface stormwater management to revitalize streets and pavements and sidewalks and parking lots and roofs. And it's going to be, if it's fully adopted and carried out, we'll use those resources that would have gone into bigger pipes into a transformed city. Lisa Schroeder has led efforts here in the city of Pittsburgh to look at waterfront revitalization as transportation networks. And we're beginning to see the results of that. It's an amazing transformation that Pittsburgh has, and I'm hoping most of you get enough clear skies to be able to enjoy some of those waterfront experiences. NOR here in city planning has spent a huge effort trying to understand the networks through a series of Plan PGH GIS models that superimpose the networks one on top of the other so we can begin to be more creative. So we're hoping that the infrastructure workshop will gather together everybody in group 4 on their label, those who have answers, who have propositions, who have manifests of how we can turn our infrastructures into the capital we need to revitalize and rebuild the industrial city or the post-industrial city. We have to think about the watershed, we have to think about the waste shed, we have to think about the heat shed, we have to think about our food shed, and we've got to add to that our smart grid and our mobility grid, and we've got resources if we can find a way to change the dialogue. I look forward to working with you guys in the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you. Workshop number 5 is Planning and Social Innovations. And I think I'd like to position this session as a challenge. I think most of us in the room, as Don said, are planners or work in the planning space, and I imagine that we all have very deep portfolios of work that we've done successfully in planning urban contexts. But I want to challenge us that we have not done enough in a particular class of post-industrial cities called legacy cities, which are going to be represented in our panel via Detroit and Torino. Legacy cities are cities that, in our context, Allan, Mallach, and I have been working on this as well as others in the room, are cities that are greater than 50,000 in population and have lost 20% and sometimes higher than that in population since their peak populations in the 1950s and 60s. These cities are steeped in a range of urban injustices, both physical, economic, spatial. There are families that have been living in prescribed urban renewal districts for the last 60 years. So think about that. That's 3 to 4 generations of people living in the same physical space of isolation. I want to challenge us to think about the way in which perhaps our processes and tactics for change have not evolved to really dig deeply into addressing these issues. So I think what's going to be exciting about the panel number 5, Social and Planning Innovations, is to really talk about the ways in which we're both looking at innovations in both our process and tactics. And I think what Detroit and Torino will show for us are a handful of things I'd like to highlight. One, I think that we should talk about these issues in the context of the changes that are happening in the democratic structures of these cities. When Torino first started its planning work, it was the first time it had elected a city mayor. In Detroit, as you know, or you may not know, it just recently revised its city charter to, for the first time, elect its council members by district as opposed to at large. But we do know that this is happening in a context where people believe that certain democracies have been stripped away from local Detroiters because the city is now in receivership with an emergency manager and also now in bankruptcy. We should talk about social and planning innovations in the context of the commitment to do inclusive citywide engagement and consultation. You'll see examples of how Torino did this through 3 of their processes of creating strategic plans, and you'll see how we did it in Detroit Future City, and we'll expose not only the successes of how those consultations came about, but we'll also expose some of the failures and challenges towards really engaging a civic leadership in the city. A third point that I hope we talk about is just the value of a strategic plan and a comprehensive citywide strategic plan. You'll hear from one of our thought leaders, Mindy Thompson-Fullalove, who will talk about the ecologies, marrying the ecosystems of the physical and the social. And I think meeting the challenges of these types of legacy cities is how we embrace moving towards doing integrated planning that integrates both of those systems. And lastly, we'll talk about the investments and implementation approaches that need to also move into more innovation spheres. Torino, fortunately, had a national government and a national partner in investment that moved Torino from its state of crisis starting in the 70s to where it is today. Our country, and unless someone has a CNN tweet with an update about the status of our federal government, I'm not sure that we have that commitment, and I'm not sure, as you'll hear from Bruce Kratz, that we're going to be able to rely on that kind of commitment in moving our cities forward. So what are the innovations and investment that we need to deploy moving forward? Torino had a wonderful opportunity through the catalytic investment of an Olympics. Detroit and many cities like it talk more about the incremental approaches to revitalizing their cities. And our other thought leader, Hank Dittmar, will talk about this balance or tension between the big planning and the small, lean urbanism, as he calls it. And where's the space in between? Is it really an either-or proposition, or do we have to do both? But luckily, both of these cities, I think, succeeded, or at least on the path to their urban transformations, because they all recognized the importance of a collective and multi-sectoral leadership that had to be in place in order to move transformation forward. It's not just government, it's not just local government, it's not just federal government, it's not just philanthropy. All of these sectors really need to come together in order to move planning and social innovations forward. So I hope that our session will really push the envelope in challenging our practices as technicians, as well as our practices of consultation, and offer propositions and manifestos for forward thinking in these cities. Thanks.